everyone. So all that is Martin Michael, the director of the and I'm delighted to welcome our talk of the winter session. And I'm very excited to finally have the time in what schedule to have with us Jennifer Chen, who is the Bertram Law Research Chair at the University. She's also advising research of the Conférencière, and also a faculty member and one of the founders of the Center for Neuralink. And she's one of the top thought leader in the world, neurotechnologies and the ethics and governance of this. She's still most people assume to sci-fi a few months ago, years ago, and I think now it kind of moved to current affairs. And when you see who is behind some of these technologies, we may have some concerns. So I'm very delighted to have her with us today to share some of her research and thinking, what has been working on human development. So without further ado.
Thank you for being here. I'm always really delighted to see so many of the topic. It's fun to find fellow travelers who are always the same topic. So welcome. I can answer questions in French, right? So let me launch in. I have this usual routine, about 3 hours of material to do, maybe 1 hour. But what I'm going to try to do is have a sort of modular approach where I give you a very quick lay of the land of the issues that I see, and then we'll move through them more slowly. If we don't get to the last one, at least you've heard the short form. We can talk about it in Q&A after as well. So first question might be, first question. First problem has arrived. Let's see. Try this. There we go. Cool. The first question might be, why are we interested in the ethical issues about efforts to detect mental states? I'm going to come to the neurotechnologies and everything in a moment, but let me just tell you why am I even asking this question? Because after all, we spend our time guessing at the mental states of others, making all kinds of judgments about what they might be thinking. Theory of mind is something that develops in childhood. It's very important for us to understand and predict people's behavior. So we're always guessing at people's mental states. So what's the big deal? We also guess at people's cognitive, functional, mental capacities by observing demeanor, behavior, and so forth. So it's so important for us to predict behavior and states, mental states, as well as to evaluate mental states. Why would one ask questions about the ethics of doing so? So I think it's worthwhile asking these questions because there's growing interest in looking directly at the brain and brain activity data, and sometimes structural information, but mostly activity in the brain, to then infer certain mental states or functions. That's present term. It's a bit different. We're actually not using our tried and true millennia old techniques of looking at people. These are culturally and socially dependent to some extent, but it's also shared aspect of the process of guessing at what people are thinking. This is a bit different. We're not actually looking at the person and what they say and their behavior, but looking at the brain. We'll talk more about what might be different about this in a minute. But one of the things that has emerged out of this growing interest in looking at gathering and trying to interpret it, concern about mental privacy. Does our ability to pick up your brain data threaten mental privacy? So there's a little slip between what I've said here. I said we're getting brain activity data with mental privacy, so we have to understand what's the link between this pattern of blood flow and electrical signals, even mental state. There's a lot of steps. And so if we're going to try to make some sort of judgments on the data first, we need to look pretty closely at logic and many steps in between. One of the topics we'll talk about, but also the implications of this shift. We have this new source of information. Do something better. I think that's an open question. Then we have done traditionally by looking. So that's a first question, like, is mental privacy at risk? What do we even mean by mental privacy? We haven't had that concept. We talk about privacy, personal privacy, all sorts of different forms of privacy. But because we haven't been able to threaten the record of mental privacy, we haven't really thought of a concept or meaning or justification for its protection and boundaries for the scope of that protection. We also don't think about mental liberty or cognitive liberty so much because we haven't typically been able to reach what Latin scholars would call a forum internum, or the internal zone. So that. Also, we also have to think about the trade-off, because the history of privacy and technological evolution is one of developing ways to access new sources of information and then having to deal with the consequences. And so there's a sort of evolution in where we put the boundaries of privacy of the private realm. Okay, that's why we're doing this. So here's a roadmap. So we're going to start. I'll tell you a bit about the neurotechnology. So can I ask quickly, just so I know who's here, who has any background in brain technologies, neuroscience, and so forth? Okay, well, we got about 8. Who's in law? Who's not in law? Okay, all right. There's something for everybody. This gives me a bit of information on how to go on some of these. So we'll talk about very for the neurotechnology people. It's going to be very simplistic, but we're going to do a high-level overview of some of the technologies that are in development and some of the big trends in their development. Then the possible uses of that brain data that's being collected through these technologies. I want to talk about that chain of inferences because that's an important foundation for doing the ethics. If you don't understand what that we're purporting to do, it's hard to implications in a clear-eyed way. And then finally, I want to get to 6 ethical and legal questions. Here's the quick overview of what the contents of these are. I've already talked about mental privacy. What is it? How do we protect it? How much do we protect it? Accuracy. We make this inference. I have an inference about your mental state. I'm going to use it for some purpose. How sure do I have to be of its accuracy? What's the threshold for accuracy? And you might immediately say, as often people in science say, well, it has to be perfect. Well, actually, we make a lot of decisions on a lot slimmer foundations. So there's something to be said about what that threshold is going to be. And then I want to talk also about conditions, because it's not just the detection of a current mental state that's sometimes an interest. Are you in pain? Are you alert? Are you being receptive? But what we're interested in is what that current mental state says about some future behavior. We're talking about forensic applications, risk assessment applications. Then there's this topic of names and organizations that read minds, because there's a lot of people will say this whole gets tight. You're talking about reading minds, and only read them. Now, it's just to find that followed by that and be concise about what's possible. But the tenor of the conversation is all excuse me. Reading minds is bad, and we shouldn't do it. Well, actually, the flip side is for people who cannot communicate, technologies that will read minds might offer. So I think we have to also ask the Congress obligation to make available that are very I find this one very interesting. It's not, I didn't characterize it as a legal issue. It's more of a ethical, social issue, I think. But I think there's something really interesting happening when we say we bring data from could be anybody. You want to be look at the brain. It really tells you that that memory is something about it. So and you say, well, it sure feels real to me. And we set up a system, if we are to credit brain data, where we prefer the objectively gathered and then interpreted brain data over the subjective self-report. This is not do for. We could disbelieve you, we could think you're mistaken, we could think you're lying. We couldn't say that your brain furnishes us objective evidence that your memory is mistaken, for example. So what happens with epistemic authority? Who do we believe? Do we believe you or your brain? And typically, sort of past philosophical discussions of epistemic justice have talked about different knowers as sources of information and said, well, it's unjust to disbelieve a certain person because of gender, sex, race, whatever. This is a very different kind of epistemic justice. It's like two versions of you, like your brain and you, your subjective first-person perspective. And now we're going to provide those one can't over the other. How do we think about that from a justice and authority perspective, as well as philosophical perspective? So you may be thinking, well, that's really far out. But I'm going to bring it home with an actual sort of legal precedents for this kind of problem, and also some applications where this might make sense. Could we detect false confessions, for example? And then finally, ownership of the mind. And this is something I've been thinking about more actually in talking to people who have participated in trials of brain-computer interfaces or are receiving therapies of brain stimulation devices, who are like, I'd like to have access to my own brain data. Or I'd like to know what stimulation parameters are being applied to my brain because I want the information. It's actually maintaining my mental function. It's part of my mind. So how do you think about the ownership of brain data? And there's something very peculiar for you lawyer types out there, interested in intellectual property, about the idea that you could be having a creative thought of imagination, which externalized would potentially attract copyright ownership rights, intangible intellectual property. But we could, like, I'm speculating a bit here now, but bear with me for the moment. You can detect the brain data, decode the image or the words, put it on a piece of paper, and produce that same result. But what is the chain of ownership there? It goes via brain data. Do you have ownership of your brain? And if it relates to the products of the mind, how do we sort that out? We're a little bit early days to be worrying about this, but the question of access to the outputs, the brain data out of your brain, are a live issue that has been the subject of a court case before the Supreme Court of Chile. So this is to some extent here. All right. My intro to 1148. So in neurotechnologies, I should mention if the question that you'd like to raise as I'm going along, feel free to up your hand. Like there's no need to wait till the end if you'd like to. Well, here's a bit of an overview. At a high level, there's a way I divide up the neurotechnologies for my own organizing it in my own head. We have devices and procedures that get information at the structure and function of the nervous system. I'm calling that readout, get info. Then there's a second group of technologies that modulate the function of the nervous system, or write in, so to speak, in a loose sense. And then there's a third category which brings them together at the same time. So an example of this would be a brain-computer interface. Say there's an electrode implanted over the motor cortex. It's picking up information about intended movement. It's reading it out, it's decoding it, it's using it to move the platform. And sensors in the fingertips of the end sense pressure, which is relayed to the sensory cortex. Stimulates that part of the brain, and the participant feels stimulation of some type. I've had it described to me as all sorts of things in their fingertips. And so the idea of this feedback is to improve the naturalness of control of the device by actually getting not just visual feedback of what the device is doing, but tactile or sensory or haptic feedback. So there's an example of both. So there's a broad range of methods to get the brain data. You can do structural imaging. This is familiar to everybody, an MRI, for example. Functional imaging, which looks at patterns of blood flow. Actually, it looks at patterns of oxygenation and deoxygenation in the blood. And from that, infers activity on the theory that activity depletes glucose, which brings forth a fresh supply of oxygenated blood, and from that you can start to figure out patterns of activity in the whole brain. There's this is being done by MRI, but there's also light-based methods. FNIRS uses infrared light. There's injection of radioactive tracer molecules to float around glucose. There's electrophysiology, which uses electroencephalography and a variety of other types of to get patterns of electrical activity. So not blood flow, not images, but patterns. These can be very sort of large scale, or they're quite precise with electrodes that try to record very small groups of things. These exist in both invasive and non-invasive forms, implanted or externally. And there's obviously a great interest in developing miniaturized mobile devices that can be more broadly used in a broad range of applications, because everybody has to go and sit in a big tube to use one of these devices. This is not realistic. If everybody has to have an implanted chips, that's also currently not super realistic. We just had Elon Musk's Neuralink announced for a trial in Toronto. I think the ambition there is to actually make this more widespread, but if there's surgery and things like that, there's always going to be, I guess, a limit on the extent to which that can be sort of stuff. And another big thing that's going on is the incorporation of machine learning to train decoders to detect increasingly fine-grained and complex states. And so I pulled down a couple of articles here about the reconstruction from human brain activity of mental imagery. So people observing things, the brain, the sort of optical site domain of the brain, activity there can be decoded to provide still fairly crude, but better than chance reconstruction of what the person is seeing. And similarly, this is actually very, very interesting work in the direction of communication. I'll say more about this in a moment, but the first strategy for helping people who are paralyzed and cannot communicate was to pick up the neural representations of imagined speech. The way this worked was to pick up imagined movement of the vocal tract. And this was already pretty dazzling research. And there's various versions doing this for picking up imagined speech, imagined handwriting, and so forth. But more recent research has been trying a different technique, which is to try to pick up not imagined movement, but the representation of content at the semantic. So this sounds an awful lot like mind reading, although the authors hasten to sort of assure us this is not actually mind reading. This is a much more basic thing that's going on. But what happened in this research was subjects listened to hours and hours of recorded information while enormous amounts of data were collected, and an attempt was made to map up the activity lined up with the meaning of the words that were being heard. This is an effort to do this non-invasively. So demonstrating the move from the sort of, this was done with MRI, fMRI rather, to techniques that are, the hope is that this can sort of be, well, this was also non-invasive, but this is another attempt to get at it in another way, and also another non-invasive way. So, yeah, and this is being done by the collection of massive amounts of information, which can then be processed to find these patterns, very specific patterns. So why would we want to use all this information? Well, there's obviously scientific research applications. There's many medical applications, diagnosing pain, for example, and some express that. It's very valuable information. Prognosis, identifying risk factors, biomarkers. Treatment. So we have already deep brain stimulation. This is a little picture of the NeuroPace website there, which delivers closed loop deep brain stimulation. So an electrode into brain to stimulate the brain in one location, and another to monitor the brain so that stimulation is only delivered as a sign that a seizure is. This is a great advantage to not have to stimulate all the time, save battery time, avoid side effects and so forth. So this is where everybody's trying to figure out how to do this, to find the biomarkers of the symptom that they want to disrupt with stimulation and put it together in one closed loop bidirectional device. So there's also assistive technologies, as I've mentioned, brain-computer interfaces for people who are paralyzed. And so there's a lot of really quite astounding things being done there, which you can find on YouTube if you'd like to see people using these robotic arms. Or there was something I saw recently, someone in BCI to fly. It was a demonstration that was, I'm sure it's on YouTube, to fly a drone down a zigzagged slalom path, which was being done pretty darn well with the BCI. And this is like implanted person with high spinal injury, did not move, is doing all this. Now, there's also a bunch of consumer applications. So we have gaming with virtual environments. Here we're talking about non-invasive. Generally, people are not, there's no implanted electrodes for this kind of thing so far. Controlling physical objects, monitoring and quantifying certain mental states, such as concentration, alertness, stress, information. So, emotions. So you can get headsets which will give you neurofeedback and tell you how you're feeling, etc. The emotive device also sells itself as sort of helping as a platform that can be turned into your own consumer BCI. As I say, we can convert brainwaves into digital signals that can be used to control anything that speaks in ones and zeros. Now, let's think about some potential third-party uses of the brain data. So we can think employment and workplace monitoring for alertness, discussion of safety critical workplaces where you need to actually know when someone's getting sleepy. Aptitude assessment is another possibility. Safety critical activities I mentioned. Education, there's a report a couple of years old now of a pilot test of a non-invasive device in school children to monitor their alertness. And there was a bit of a pushback against this. People thought this was a bit brave new world and didn't like it, and so it was halted. But it was sold as essentially this is a way to like improve pedagogy. We're going to know who's struggling, who's getting frustrated, who's falling asleep, and we're going to be able to better tailor the lessons, better ensure that attention is given to the students and so forth. Insurance, one can clearly see insurance applications here for health predictions, behavior predictions, or even monitoring of driving, for example, and alertness while driving. Legal and administrative applications to detect malingered pain, for example, to detect deception in court cases and interrogations, to try to guess about mental states in the past. That's not all possible. And then, so forensic risk assessment and rehabilitation. So recidivism risk. There's work, for example, if part of the risk assessment, forensic risk assessment for sex offenders involves understanding patterns of arousal. And there's all this research now on, would we actually use brain responses to detect those kinds of things? And so you can see where this is going. And neural prediction of future arrest as well, detecting recidivism risk. And note right now, is we have a massive database of people who have committed crimes, to determine if they recidivate in what way, at what time, and all kinds of factors about them: age, type of offense, age at first offense, marital status, employment status. This kind of stuff is thrown into a big database, and an instrument pops out the other end where risk factors are rated. So it's basically it's like an algorithm. It's a crude algorithm, but it's some actuarial model of risk of recidivism, and it's not perfect. It's an individual might not fit the group, and so the suggestion is that this might be a more precise way of doing it that might get better tailored information. Of course, it's going to have all the downfalls of that go along with relatively opaque system. We're not 100% sure what particular parameters. Marketing is a topic of interest as well. Lies, products and advertising. Novel biometrics. There's a suggestion that the pattern of the brain response to certain stimuli might be characteristic and could identify and distinguish one from the other. There's this suggestion of a thought pass, for example, rather than a password, a thought that you have in your characteristic way. Of course, opportunities for malicious actors of all types. Yeah, okay. Let me move on now to say a couple words about this chain of inferences. So if we're going to make these kinds of inferences from brain activity data to a mental state, what exactly is going on? So our old way of doing things is the first schematic. We observe some demeanor and behavior, and in a given cultural context, and based on our long accrued experience of interacting with other human beings, we draw an inference to a mental state. Sometimes that mental state's the thing we want to know, is this person angry? But maybe sometimes we're more interested in, are they going to punch us? And that the information of ultimate interest lies between the anger and the last inference. So there's a chain of two inferences being drawn there, unless we're interested in the mental state. Now, with brain data, we're actually doing something very similar, except now the observation is of a structural characteristic or a neurophysiological change, like a pattern of blood flow, like a pattern of electrical activity. And then we're like, aha, mental state. And then, of course, we might actually be interested in the mental state or the information of ultimate interest. And so it looks similar, but let's investigate what are the possible slippages that are happening in those images. Where I'm going with this is I'm going to suggest to you that the same kinds of problems exist for both, but we're used to this and we have a lot of data through our long sort of accrued, in my case, many decades of experience with people. Whereas here, you're not so sure we have the data that underlies the inferences, but the structural or logical pattern of what we're doing is similar. Okay, is this inference valid? Basically, in both cases, we're relying on patterns learned from prior observation. And so here's a few problems. I'm going to think now about, let's pick one. We've got a brain activity data and we've got a memory. We're trying to determine, or let's use deception. Someone's saying something and we want to know if they're being deceptive. So we know sort of what we think. Well, there's some tells. Not always perfect when someone's being deceptive in terms of gaze and voice changes and things like that. So this is how we might do it. But if we're going to try to figure it out from brain data, we have to then say, okay, well, if we want to figure out how to infer this over here, deception from this brain data, what's the mental state? Is deception the right label for the mental state? What is deception? Deception, you have to do that because you have to develop an experiment to actually elicit that state in order to map it to the brain data. So you have to be very clear, what are we going for here? And this is what we call the cognitive ontology problem. Have we understood the target construct properly? Because deception could be a whole bunch of things in the brain. It could be, okay, activate memory of the true facts. Activate modules to monitor people to see if in fact they're believing me so I can try to change my demeanor. Activate self-awareness of my own demeanor and control of my own demeanor. Activate forward planning to try to plan which of the following is going to be believed by these people for what reason. That's an awful lot of sub-processes that go into this idea of deception. Deception becomes revealed as not a super useful process to investigate at the brain level. It's a psychological social construct. So that's our first problem. Do we have like the proper list of cognitive functions to try to figure out? So let's say we figure that out. We're like, okay, well, how do we get that mental state to happen in a lab? We've got to come up with some sort of experimental paradigm to get people to produce that mental state reliably so we can look at all of their brains and try to like extract the pattern. Fine, say we've got some sort of like experiment we can do reliably in the lab. It's going to generate sort of that kind of useful pattern that we can use. Well, getting someone to lie in the lab is not like someone lying from real life, right? That's what they call the ecological validity problem. So you identify some sort of pattern in the lab, does it generalize out into the real world when you're trying to use that pattern? And here's two other problems. There's something called the reverse inference problem. So it goes like this. So I create like this paradigm in the lab. I try to get this mental state to happen. I gather a bunch of brain data. And I'm like, okay, when this mental state happens, the brain looks like this. Great. That's the forward inference. We're like, we know we have mental state. Now we can go figure out the brain data. But when we want to apply it, we're doing the reverse, right? We're looking at brains and we're saying, aha, that pattern, therefore mental state. We don't know if it's a one-to-one correspondence. It might be that brain activity could be deception, and it could be hunger, and it could be like my foot hurts. But we haven't tested all that to find out if in fact that pattern signifies those things. So we have a reverse inference fallacy because we don't know enough about all the other possible explanations of that brain state. Now, this is a problem all the time. When you see someone smiling, are they embarrassed? Are they happy? What is it, right? We have a lot of data. We can start to distinguish between them. We have contextual information. But here, this is a bit of an issue for this sort of scientific project, which there's a lot of discussion about this, but efforts to gather more and more and more information, particularly that uncertainty, basically by brute force, giving more information about what the competing explanations of that brain pattern. So this is has been called a data problem, essentially. But it is important to remember when we're actually, people are saying, I can decode like Republican political leanings in someone's brain. It's like, what else could it be? There's also the group to individual problem. And I hinted at that a moment ago, that all of this, if we're doing this big attempt to figure out what a brain looks like when it's being deceptive, this is based on large amounts of data often, if that's the way that the paradigm is set up, lots of people. And also, so yeah, lots of people and lots of instances of that person being deceptive. But a given person and instance may or may not fit that average sort of pattern. So we always have to be aware of the potential slippage between the pattern identified and individuals when you apply a group pattern to an individual. Again, we do this all the time, but it is part of this as well. And one thing that's changing a little bit is I've been talking about experiments that try to find a pattern on the basis of large numbers of people for a constrained problem and then apply it generally. But another strategy is to take a small group of people, maybe an N of one, and build personalized. This is what's being done for the brain-computer interfaces, where it's one person who listens to 60 hours of text to create a good decoder for that one person. So that changes the problem a little bit, and that's why some of these BCIs are achieving this remarkable ability of a person to fly a drone around. That's because it's being trained on that person's brain activity only. So what to conclude from all this? I think the logical problems are similar, but the amounts of data that we have are quite different. So I get to now these questions of the ethics of inferring mental states from brain data. And so I've got these 6 issues here. So let's try to cover a few of these. Let's start with mental privacy. Why are we protected? How? And how much to protect it? So how's all this sounding to you? Do you think mental privacy is a big deal or not a big deal? So those who think, yeah, these technologies threaten mental privacy or potentially threaten mental privacy. Those who say, actually, no, I don't a concern for mental privacy. Okay, that's interesting. I won't ask you to tell me why because I don't want to put you on the spot, but I'd love to know. So, okay, go for it. Yeah.
You're making it sound like this is medical data. Like you're talking about MRI scans. Mental privacy. We have like
and that's on the idea of mental privacy. One is anticipating the slide here, but let's talk about one is you cannot stepping away from your objection a moment to give a different one. Is inherently private. You cannot access the subjective phenomenological experience of having a mental state. To which I say, true. However, you can make inferences about that mental state. You can make judgments about people based on those inferences. So I think we'll still care. I can't feel your pain or understand your perception of red or have the sort of visceral sort of experience of a particular recollection that you are having. This is phenomenology, right? We cannot, it's interpersonally non-communicable, but I can make inferences about that. And I can make judgments about you. So I think mental privacy remains an issue, even if we can't access phenomenological quality of mental states. The fact of mental states and inferences about mental states can lead to judgments and harms. So I'd say that one. But to come more to your question, some people said, like, we don't need a new concept of mental privacy. What we're talking about here is brain data, information about the brain. And let's just protect brain data. And by the way, it's already protected by Personal Health Information Protection Act and Personal Information Privacy Electronic Documents Act, soon to be amended. So privacy legislation deals with this basic data about brain identifiable. So this is a legit question or a legit answer, which I guess is not saying my mental privacy is not an issue. It's more that it's already dealt with, I think, under brain privacy protection. I think is sort of the argument we make. Yeah. So what came to that? It may still be worthwhile having that concept if we think there's something different about the kinds of harms that flow from the inferences from that brain data. Because it may say something about inadequacies in how we protect brain if it leaves open the possibility of harms at the level of mental privacy. So let's see if I can persuade you in particular and the rest of you that might be the case. So let's step back a bit for people who haven't thought about what is privacy. And I think if we're going to talk about something, we have to understand what we're talking about. If we're saying we should protect it, well, we have to be able to explain why. Especially if there's like difficulty in setting parameters, we have to really get down to brass tacks and talk concretely about what we mean. Otherwise, we risk talking past each other. So privacy is famously difficult to define. It tends to mean a whole bunch of things, which for a long time legally was understood as sort of a bundle of different things. You can't walk into someone's house, that was privacy. You can't steal their bank records, that was privacy. You can't like photograph them in certain circumstances, that's privacy. You can't use their name, that's privacy. So a whole bunch of different disparate things we're all trying to get at one central core value. Well, what might it be? And basically, there's many theories, but I'll give you my favorite one, that it has to do with the separation of the individual from others in order to basically protect the formation and maintenance of the individual identity. And this requires boundaries, not just physical boundaries of locations and bodily boundaries, but also informational control of certain types to protect that separateness of identity. And so that's how we get this informational privacy, locational privacy, bodily privacy, decision-making privacy. All these things are sort of circling around the importance of the individual being separated from and free from the surveillance of or interference and flow from access of the individual. And notice also that privacy, the ability to reduce that separation is what allows us to have friendships and intimate relationships. It's the chosen like the self-chosen reduction of that separation in some ways from other people. So you could say that the ability to have human relationships also is a function of our ability to maintain privacy. So supports the formation and maintenance of individual identity and development and well-being. These things are all central to sort of human flourishing. And so this is done by shielding people from the constraints that come with surveillance. protects people from the risks of exploitation and harm that comes with people knowing too much about you, and so being able more to manipulate and exploit you, and allows this graduated degrees of self-revelation. And I would say that mental privacy seems to lie at the core of all of this, right? Is it's space free from surveillance, to have your thoughts and think and develop, to share the degree you want your internal world with others. And so it would seem that having the mental truly separable from others is actually pretty important and aligned with all of the reasons we might protect privacy. And you might actually think also that in some of our actual quotidian, boring, normal, accepted forms of privacy protection are actually about mental privacy. So why is it good not to have people surveilling you? Well, you have a home, you have a place where people can't come and look at you. It allows you to actually drop the masks that you know in public in order to protect from too much reading of your own thoughts and relax when you're not being surveilled. It may be that that private location, we protect it in part because of that. The privacy of diaries, similarly. So back to this point, does the collection and dissemination of brain data threaten mental privacy? Well, as I said, I think it depends sort of how you understand privacy in the mind, but I would say that to the extent that inferences are being drawn about the mind, then yes, it could threaten this mental privacy. Notice it doesn't matter if the inferences are necessarily correct. People can draw incorrect inferences and still have consequences for you. I think another thing that's important to keep in mind here, and this we're sort of getting to the point of, well, what do we do about this, is that there's a couple key problems with all privacy protections, including attempts to protect brain data, to protect mental. One, it's very hard to predict and prevent secondary uses. And so I don't know if you've heard of this case of Ross Compton, but he had a pacemaker and he was accused of insurance fraud and arson, trying to burn his house down. And the court subpoenaed his pacemaker data and got a cardiologist to interpret it. And they basically said, well, he wasn't doing what he said he was doing at the time he said he was doing it. So this was used actually to convict or to prosecute. He ended up dying partway through the litigation, but we got to the point of the court actually accepting as admissible this pacemaker data to impeach his credibility. So I bet he wasn't thinking about that when he got his pacemaker. So here's this question, like the brain data will be created. And I've had very interesting conversations with one neurotech company that has long information on somebody for epilepsy. And he was actually being prosecuted for punching someone, and they went back into the data to find he had a little mini seizure at the moment. So it can be exculpatory as it can be indicting of someone, but people don't really foresee necessarily that potential use. So it's hard to predict and prevent it. Once the data exists, and is useful, it becomes a challenge to suggest. Another big problem with privacy protection is everyone goes immediately to the informed consent as the resolution of all this. But we all know how easy it is to get people to consent to almost anything, especially to give out personal data. You just hand out like the hope of, I don't know, some BuzzFeed article or like something like that. And it's like, yeah, sign me up. So relying on consent is not good because people don't take it seriously, but also for a second reason, people don't have a choice. What if you need to get your brain data in order to be able to use an assistive device? Well, sorry, something flying around here. People who actually need the device for assistive purposes, and you say, fine, you consent to us collecting all of your brain data in perpetuity for whatever purposes we want. Well, informed consent is not a full answer to what's appropriate there. So how should the law respond? Well, we can do a whole bunch of things. We can prohibit access to data, which would then cause all kinds of problems because that data is useful. There's a big movement to open science to try to get big data sets for doing all this statistical analysis that I was telling you about. Hold back neuroscientific research. We could have access with consent. I told you, not always very useful. We could have access with notice. we could say, hey, all kinds of access, but use restrictions. And this is an interesting strategy that was used in the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act in the US, which says, yeah, we can have this data, but it cannot be used for certain purposes. And so this is a strategy that would allow sort of tailored, more precise protections to be put on that data in environments where we're concerned. Okay. So just very, very quickly, there are now already early legal amendments mentioning brain privacy in some US states and other, especially Latin America has been amendments. But often we talk about brain data privacy, but not mental privacy. But notice Minnesota has stated mental privacy. There's also the first brain data privacy lawsuit referring to a recent amendment to the Chilean Constitution, which talks about protection of brain activity and the information coming from it. So to some extent, in some locations, the train has left the station, but there are still questions about, okay, well, exactly what should be protected and how. So, whoops, I went backwards. Let me move to the second question. So how accurate does this have to be before we draw an inference and make some social decision based on it? Is there one reliability threshold, or does it depend on the context and the circumstances? And secondly, is accuracy the only relevant value? So people who've done criminal law, when you think about admissibility of evidence and the question of prejudicial value being like probative value outweighing or not prejudicial effects, that is showing that there's some value other than probative value, right? And so is accuracy relevant? Or would we trade off accuracy because there's some other useful thing that's data or is bringing us? And so we already make inferences about mental states and we tolerate unknown error rates. Some of the other values are cost, practicality, transparency, democracy, and technocracy. Imagine in a court, it was very interesting. If you look through the history of how DNA and the polygraph have been treated in criminal law, in the early days of DNA, you saw courts saying, what? We can't use this DNA evidence and white coat people talking about 1 chance in a million and blah, blah, yada, yada. This is like take over by the white coats of our system. And there's all this romantic language, facing a jury of your peers and so forth. Well, that gave way pretty fast. It only took about 4 or 5 years. And then it was like, it would be a miscarriage of justice not to accept DNA evidence. What had shifted? Sort of the cultural acceptance of the very unimpeachable reliability of the DNA evidence. You could not have a justice system creating verdicts inconsistent with confidence, so it had to be folded in. And so, but still, why I tell you about this sort of little historical moment with DNA is it shows this sense that having it taken over the decision-making, becoming remote and uninterpretable and unintelligible to the average person, the white coat, judgment by computer algorithm. People don't like that idea very much. They want to understand how it works. And so that is one limitation of the use of this brain data. And so anyway, I think the right question, Dell is telling me some stuff here and I want to hit it because I'll probably remind later. Does the brain-based method offer, I think this is the right question, does the brain-based method offer a more accurate approach? And is that accuracy worth the trade-offs in a given context? Now this, of course, let me try to give you an example of this. So I'm working with my team, which is sitting over there. Shout out to team. We are looking at a couple of 100 cases from India in the criminal law. And these are cases that mention the use of something called BOS or BAP, which refers to brain electrical oscillation signature. Forget the app for the moment, but it's this idea of brain mapping. And this brings us to something, an approach that has been used, is being used in India and has been attempted in the States and a couple of other jurisdictions. It's used, I get it, it's used in investigative contexts in Singapore and other locations too. But in court, admissible in court, in India and an attempt in the US, to my knowledge. But two slightly different technologies with the same sort of logic. Brain mapping is an attempt to distinguish between true and false memory of some information. So does the person, did they actually experience it and have the rich memory flowing from that? Or do they just were they just told about it and recollecting having been told about it, a much slimmer memory. This brain mapping purports to be things that do with obvious utility in figuring out if the accused person was at the scene of crime, for example. Brain fingerprinting, a little bit different, is something being developed or being pushed a little bit, to be honest. There was this company called No Lie MRI and others, different topic. Brain fingerprinting, what was the name? I'm forgetting the name of the company. It didn't really go anywhere. It attempted to get admissibility in the US unsuccessfully and has been a little bit more run since then, but it's using electroencephalography to detect a particular neural response called the P300 response associated with the recognition of significant stimulus. But again, the idea is both are forms, well, the second one is a form of a guilty knowledge test. We try to see if you recognize something you shouldn't recognize, like a polygraph. So why is it accepted in India? There is critique within India. This is something that's state forensic service, forensic science service. And we're up to nearly 300 cases. We stopped looking a couple years ago, so maybe up to 300 by now. And the question is, why would it be expensive, maybe ineffective? There's not sort of a robust sense that it's correct. And the answer is it can serve social needs. So let's look at what's the legal position in India. So the state forensic services also offer a variety of other scientific techniques that are not widely used as admissible evidence elsewhere, including polygraph and narcoanalysis. We have cases in Canada on both of those. It has been, I think the first case we saw mention of it was 2002. And the Indian Supreme Court weighed in 2010 about whether a suspect could be forced to undergo this test. Answered no, can't force the person. But a voluntary test is acceptable with safeguards. And one of the interesting things the court said, it didn't endorse this necessarily, it repeated the suggestion that these techniques offer something very valuable in reducing the, quote, regrettably high incidence of third-degree methods. So in a context of police brutality and interrogations, and also a heavily burdened justice system or investigation system, inadequate resources, big backlog, people being accused who can't clear their name, also pressure on the services to try to find the perpetrator faster. They may resort to brutal techniques. And the idea here is, we could go over here and try this scientific non-brutal technique, which will solve all kinds of problems at once. So there's a great book written by a woman called Ginny Lokaniti, which sort of talks about the socio-legal aspects of this and why this is appealing. Even a technique that's unproven is appealing in a given context. It solves other problems. So social purposes served by these techniques. Here we can see under-resourcing, backlog, pressure to solve cases, and a wide level of fear of the police in the Indian context. A couple of cases that we came across helped to illustrate this kind of issue. So many cases in which a false accusation and ask for the brain fingerprint. This is interesting because the American cases were all an accused person trying to exculpate themselves. In a circumstance where they're struggling to be believed, they ask for this. So there's a question about making fair answer and defense. There's also concerns about corruption. It's one thing that's saying, I think the prosecution was wrong. This is another reason objective evidence might be saying that for one reason or another, just to save the real culprits, there was this change in the line of investigation, shoddy and suspicious investigation. And then a third really interesting observation is that volunteering for this, to subject yourself to this kind of thing, offers a kind of a signaling function to the police, to the court, that you are innocent because you're willing, if you believe that this can ferret out information that would be put you at risk, your willingness to undergo it is a signal of innocence. And so we can see in this one case, the judge saying, if he were guilty, he would not have had the guts to throw the challenge to the top brass of the police department to subject him to these tests. So Anyway, I take you through this to just sort of say a few things. One, there may be other reasons why it's useful. And I would say also another piece here is our current methods of detecting whether to believe someone or not, the veracity of a witness. There's lots of evidence that people who are better looking, who are this ethnicity or that ethnicity, are more likely to be believed than others. And there's dangers also of cultural differences in demeanor. So our abilities right now to detect deception in an equitable manner. So not this, maybe this isn't sufficiently proven, but could it be that brain data can help with this is a question I think worth asking. So I think, what time are we at here? 30. So we have 20 minutes left. I have talk about prediction. We could talk about I remember my issues. The obligation to read minds. We could talk about that epistemic authority, or we could talk about ownership of the mind. Anybody care about one of those more than the other? Sorry?
Ownership.
Ownership. We can probably fit in two. Is there someone else?
Prediction.
Prediction. Okay. You had your chance, folks. So we'll start with prediction. We'll come back. So what are the risks of, so we talked about the extent, like the inferential chain. We're going to get access to a mental state right now. But what if we're wanting to move forward extra inference to some behavior or mental state in the future? And we can see that this might be valuable in a whole bunch of different contexts, like employment. We're trying to figure out who to hire, personality, aptitudes, mental health care. Right now, people are hospitalized or not based on some sort of judgment about whether they pose a danger to themselves or others. Criminal justice is this question of forensic risk assessment, and that determines sentence placement, levels of security, all of this having significant consequences for the individual and for public safety. Child protection also is all about whether the child is at risk in different ways. So there's a lot of interest in prediction. We probably get it wrong a lot of the time. It's possible that that error is not evenly distributed. So it may well be that we could improve how we do things. Again, it's balanced against this kind of technocratic, opaque system. People have to understand and feel that it's fair. But let's at least open the question about whether our current way of doing this could be improved. So I talked about the criminal justice system and our forensic risk assessment models. These are based on this longitudinal studies of large samples, and then there's all these weighted factors to come out with some sort of prediction. People are put into buckets, and that determines their fate. There was a Supreme Court case in 2018, the Ewart case, which was a challenge by a man who was of Métis heritage, and he claimed that he should not have the forensic risk tools applied to him because they were normal, mostly white population, just because the white population is so much larger, there's more data points. And so it's largely a white population. And this is an interesting problem because the question is, if you don't do that, what's the alternative? If you're to try to make a model based on people from narrower and smaller groups, they become increasingly unreliable because they're so small. You get they're not statistically valid for use. So do you abandon that statistical approach entirely for people who, for one reason or another, don't fit closely the data set on which the model is built? And the problem with doing that is the whole reason the system moved using this algorithmic sort of forensic risk assessment tool approach was that before that, you'd have some forensic psychiatrists sit down, read the file, and based on their own sense of patterns and also their own reaction to the come up with some sort of risk assessment. This was very arbitrary and variable, and it really mattered who assessed you and what they thought of you. And there was efforts to improve this by making structured interviews where you had to consider certain things in certain ways, but the flexibility still remained. And the move to this model was meant to try to reduce that arbitrary variability and to increase the accuracy. And so when we're saying we're not going to use it, we have to move then back to how then are we going to make the decision of risk? And we move back to that sort of one-off approach where who you talk to and what they consider and how they weight it, maybe idiosyncratic and hard to predict. So what did happen after Ewert? This is an interesting question. I teach the mental health law course, and so I talk about this in that class. And I went back to look at what happened in the cases after it, because the court said, look, correctional services has to make a better model, and left open how that was to be done and when. And instead, what courts have done since then is they now still use the models, but they say this is not the only information that we're using. So they leave open the fact that other information will be integrated. I'm not 100% sure any actual significant change in practice has occurred as a result of this decision, partly because we're having to make the decision one or the other. And so all this comes back to this question that I throw out to you of if brain data or the integration of measures as one piece is a data point that is that helps to reduce the flaws, maybe it's of interest. On the other hand, again, how are we going to determine which particular brain patterns or features are going to improve the situation? There's a lot of, I was reading, there's a couple of people who were involved in developing the main forensic risk assessment instruments, and they're quite bullish on this. They think this would really improve the models. But again, we're early days. But I think, actually, here we are, Bryce and Harris, 2016, are the authors of the main risk assessment, saying this is the best long-term prospect for eventually increasing the accuracy. Okay, so I think which is different from our forensic risk assessment tools that are based on these models of who employed, what age, what's their age, et cetera, and moving into this brain-based information is we interpret brain information in very specific. There's a tendency to regard it as very determinative of outcomes, things we can't do anything much about. And so you can see the concern about self-fulfilling prophecies. If you tell someone, we've looked at your brain and you have a recidivism risk of 70%. You can say that based on the model, based on employer, blah, 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 70%. And people tend to interpret those differently as saying something different about the person. And there's concern, this Omeniac case was one in which there was a suggestion that a person's brain should be looked at to try to get to the root of understanding. And the court was concerned that if we were to do something like that, like have someone say, well, it's not me, it's the brain damage. A sense of externalizing responsibility, which might undermine self-efficacy and rehabilitation. So I think if we start looking at brain data and about people based on, we might create a powerful psychological self-fulfilling effect in a way that perhaps is stronger than other predictions we might make based on other sort of less sort of inherent sort of properties of that person. Okay. So let me say a quick word about ownership. So I mentioned this at the outset. This is something I'm just starting to think about. It's, I think, interesting. Is this ownership of brain data? See a couple of articles here where there's reconstruction of mental imagery. So you can actually have someone looking at something and then have decoding of what they're presently seeing. But there's research also trying to get at mental imagery. What is the person in their mind's eye sort of conjuring up and trying to decode that? And also, one of the earlier articles I showed you, which was trying to map semantic content, an experiment in which the person was there imagining telling a story. They were attempting to map out what that's going on. And not too bad a job of it. So all this gets me to what original creative imagining prior to externalizing could be picked up and decoded. If we're clear that the externalized output would be owned as the creative output, authorship of the person, what about the brain data, which is being picked up by a third party and decoded over here on the other side? So maybe we're a bit early. Florian was saying some of this is a bit sci-fi, so I will fully admit we're not kind of there yet. But I think it's an interesting question about that separation again of the person's sort of output from the brain representation of that output. And then the ownership or control inputs to the brain. So I was a guest editor for an issue of brain stimulation. One of the articles, which is a kind of an unusual case study that we ended up publishing, was from this man, Mark McCullough, who was implanted for Parkinson's disease with deep brain stimulation. And he was arguing, I want the information about the stimulation that's been put into my brain. Now, he wanted it because he was a data kind of guy. He liked to understand all these things. He was a computer programmer. But this stimulation has effects on mental functioning as well. And especially as we move into using DBS for psychiatric applications, there's a real way in which these devices are producing and maintaining given mental states. So should that person have access to that data if they want it? If it's data not about the mental state, it is the mental state. It is the data that is creating the mental state in interaction with the person's brain. So who owns that data? Is it the person who invents the device and can decide what data is available for whom? Or is it in some real way information of that person? So I think as we develop more different kinds of devices where we're collecting this data, the question of its ownership, I think, is going to be important. We see this also in the context of in the work we're doing with people who are in the research trials of brain-computer interfaces, some of whom want access to the brain data that's being recovered from their brain. And here we run up against issues around the research project wanting to keep their data for research and not to have it wandering around. So that's coming up already, even though I say this is a bit sci-fi in terms of intellectual property law. It's coming up in the research context around research ethics and what is due to participants in research trials. Admittedly, not everybody wants access to it, but some do. And so we're in a project now trying to think through this and think what the rules should be in terms of ownership of that data and access to that data, control of that data. So I'm going to stop there, and I really apologize that I've gone this long. We have exactly 8 minutes. Feel free. Yes.
Student mature indigenous, and I wonder about FASD, drugs, things that may substantially change the way you're running it. And knowing that at baseline compared to when it's taken later. What do you think change how things function?
Yeah, and I think probably it does. That makes sense. And are you
do it in the person who's thinking tennis to do this
yeah, oh gosh. Intention, that is a tricky thing. And could we detect intention? It's difficult because often a lot more many months or years after the event. Time is going to be difficult. We're usually stuck with trying to understand the situation. So I think our current approach to responsibility is very simple and crude. Section 16 of the criminal code of you have to understand and appreciate your what you're doing and its wrongfulness. They try to apply that, but boy, does it ever not work so well sometimes, because we don't have a good concept for irresistible impulses and impulse control problems. The courts say we can't distinguish between an irresistible impulse and an impulse not resisted. And I think with FASD, there's a lot of trouble with exactly control. There's going to be some impulsivity question there. We have to figure out how do we want that to map up to our concepts of moral living. And I thought you were maybe going in a different direction, because I'm actually chairing a national assessment of the Academy of Health Sciences right now. We're looking at all the substantial problems that diagnosing PTSD, because to get diagnosed, you have to have evidence of prenatal alcohol exposure, which many people don't have. But also, it's actually, the test is very labor intensive. You have to have a whole bunch of expert reports. So there's interest in, oh, can we find a biomarker for disease or a characteristic pattern of impairments that we could actually identify much faster, and then people get diagnosed with all of the harms and benefits that flow from the diagnosis. But if, for example, access to some supports is needed on diagnosis, they're going to want the diagnosis, or if access to an exculpating account in a criminal code relies upon diagnosis, we want to get people the diagnosis as well. So that's another intersection of trying to figure out who to look to the brain to find a particular pattern that might help with diagnosis is a whole issue as well. Yeah. Yes. Yes.
With all your knowledge and experience in this field, you sleep soundly at night. If you don't, what keeps you up?
So, yeah. Very good question. Several things keep me up at night, but I think the one that terrifies me the most is that we figure out how to like stimulate pleasure centers in the brain. I think to create pleasure and suffering directly in the brain, I think is a terrible capacity that we should probably not have, given our ability to regulate our own consumption of various drugs and other activities. They're so easy to manipulate and to get hooked on all kinds of things. Like the moment we figured out how to do that directly to the brain, I think that's a very dangerous moment.
Sugar does that.
Oh yeah. Scrolling on TikTok, whatever. But imagine if you could have a little electrode, you just press a button, you don't have to go get sugar. Yes.
Thanks so much for your presentation. My mind went to the charter and like freedom of thought, section 2, or right to life, liberty, security of the person, section 7. So what are the charter agreements that come forward and them compelling?
So which section 2 in
Like section 2, freedom of thought.
But
Yeah. And then section 7 in terms of maybe the predictive side of things, if your liberty might be threatened by the predictive aspect of this technology.
So this is an excellent question that I don't have a very good answer for you right now. So I'm going to skate away to a slightly different answer, which is that because a lot of this there's a lot in development, I don't have good Canadian jurisprudence for you. You could look at the Selby case, for example, where they're talking about the state forced use on someone. They talked all about self-incrimination. They talked all about all sort of the Indian equivalents of our concepts, including liberty and bodily integrity, self-incrimination, all kinds of things like that. Speech. So that is a good sort of case to read, sort of start thinking about how it might play out under our equivalent concepts. I think what we're seeing actually right now, this is escaping a different answer to your question, is there's this ferment of people saying we need novel neural rights because our existing rights don't properly capture this. And so if you Google neural rights, you'll see like a foundation that proposed a list of them. It's maybe not the best list there, but there's some other candidate lists in the literature saying we should have, for example, an explicit right to cognitive liberty and freedom of thought and a whole bunch of other things. And the argument is that our current concepts just aren't not up to the top. Now, there's a lot of other people, including me to some extent. I'm still haven't mapped out my position on this, but there's a risk if we say all these rights that we've had for decades and centuries over here are not up to the what we have done, we put firm boundary around them so they can't evolve. Change of technologies and societies to capture. I don't think that's a great idea. I think they're articulated at a high level in order for us to do work of figuring out what are our values here, how are they therefore this right captures this. I think they have to do that because otherwise we're going to proliferate a new classes of rights every time we get some new power and ability. So I think that's happening right now, which is why I'm a little bit dodgy on answering your question. But it's super interesting, and We're trying to like have a new. Okay, well, the arguments, do we need it? What are the resources already? Work on this. This is happening in real time. Like, no, a UN commission report this. And then you come back to, yeah.
Some of the things you reviewed at the top of the presentation, both brain scans, MRI, I knew about those applications because they were medical procedures for a while. But I had no idea about the applications that you described in your presentation. You could like predict what someone is saying. Good, aesthetic wins that are really and, for these applications like Neuralink yes, emotive. Yeah. So I'm just wondering, you also mentioned that these products were not ready yet. So my question is, are we can
Other forms of so there's some of these kinds of applications, kinds of social purposes, criminal justice, and all of it. That's actually much less well established, I think. Media, which had it in 2002, but so that's where I'm looking a little bit more to the future. I think it's fair to say that it's in a very small population, I think, and largely for therapeutic applications because it's risky to get brain surgery and it's expensive. So I think where we will see this opening up is when small we may have to actually cut it off because I'm not sure if there's going to be a class coming in. We're trying to get in. Okay. Oh, you're in the class. Okay.
No, but I'm very curious.
Give us your question.
Okay, great. I can be quick. Thanks again for the talk. I learned about the parental treatment of like different kinds of neural activity, be it like memory versus making emotional states, etc. See any reasons to treat those differently? And could you imagine maybe a system where it's legal to collect kinds of neural activity, but not others?
Maybe, but it gets really complicated because there's this whole field of what passive BCI, which is trying to and frustration and to correct the direction the wheelchair is going. So we say, well, not emotional stuff. Well, it's actually useful for having a driver. Just going to go motor. You go motor plus emotions. Yeah, better. So these are going to be hard. Which is a problem for law. Like laws get complicated without getting a separate rule for each possible application of everything. We try to get these principles and rules that are more general. So I think that's going to be an issue, I think, for us. Thanks very much for coming, everyone.